Okay, today we are going to work on the relative clauses exercise 4. And in this exercise, we're going to be talking about the difference between what's called restrictive and non-restrictive relative clauses. But before we do that, I just want to review really quickly and remind you of those 5 relative pronouns. We've really been focusing on those first 3. So who, that, which, whose, and whom. And I want to remind you that when we use the relative pronoun who, we use that with people, and we can sometimes use commas. Do we have to use commas? No, but we'll sometimes use commas. This exercise today will help you understand when you do and when you don't. The relative pronoun which is used with things, and we are always going to use commas every single time. And then finally, the relative pronoun that can be used with people or things, and we are never going to use commas. So hopefully you have that written down in your notebook. If you didn't write it down the other day, go ahead and pause the screen, write it down because you need to commit this to memory for me, okay? Keep this in mind. This is really important, and it's really going to help you be successful for the next few upcoming exercises with relative clauses. Okay, so you've obviously seen that relative clauses sometimes are punctuated with commas and sometimes without. The reason for that is because of those strange terms that I just told you a couple of minutes ago. Those clauses, some of them are restrictive, and some of them are non-restrictive. So as we go through this, sometimes you're going to see like a big R after one of my sentences that I give to you. Sometimes you're going to see an NR, and all that means is restrictive and non-restrictive. And we're going to talk about what that means in just a second. But so here's 2 examples. Okay. And the step in understanding the difference between these 2 sentences is simply to read them correctly. Okay. Kind of listen to how I read them, and then we'll talk about what I did. So example 1 says, the crow who is sitting in the tree is creepy. And then example 2 says, the crow who's sitting in the tree is creepy. So notice that I had that NR next to example 1 and that R next to example 2. NR, once again, just means non-restrictive. R means restrictive. Now, the first sentence I read and I paused for a full second at each of those 2 commas. And then the second sentence, I tried to read without pausing at all. Hopefully you kind of heard that and you could hear the difference between the 2. But to kind of help you understand the difference between restrictive and non-restrictive, I'm going to give you a little visual, okay? So here's my sentence. I'm going to say, the crow who is sitting in the tree is creepy. So just like in my first example, that relative clause is non-restrictive, and it works like a really big adjective, right? So it just adds some detail that further describes the crow, right? So the most important part of that sentence, if we take away that relative clause, who is sitting in the tree, we'll see that the most important part of that sentence is the crow is creepy, right? So the writer here of that first example just wants to stress that the crow is creepy, and then they're adding some less important information. Oh, by the way, that creepy crow happens to be sitting in that tree over there, right? So when we think of our non-restrictive clause, we're going to think of it like a really big adjective, okay? And so that's why it's sort of separated by those commas. It's almost like those commas feel like parenthetical almost, like not necessarily essential information to get to the gist of what that sentence is actually trying to say, right? Because the sentence was saying the crow is creepy, right? But the crow just happened to be sitting in the tree too. So now here is how the restrictive clause works, right? So this one I would have read like this. The crow who's sitting in the tree is creepy. So now in this example, we have to make sense of it by assuming that there are several crows, right? So there's one on the fence. He should pop up. There we go. There are 2 on the telephone pole. Yep, there they are. There's one on a rock. Yep. And there's one in the tree, right? Oh, yeah, I see it. We happen to know that one of these crows is creepy, but we don't know which one, right? But a farmer happens to be standing nearby. And so we ask him, hey, which of these crows happens to be the creepy one? And he replies, the crow who's sitting in the tree is creepy. And so that's the purpose of a restrictive relative clause, just to single something out from a larger group. So in this case, we have a bunch of crows, right? And then we're restricting it to a certain subgroup. So in this case, it's the one that's sitting in the tree. So we're restricting it from a bigger group. And that's why it's called restrictive clause. Okay? So I want you to add this to today's notes as well. All right? And I want you to memorize it. Non-restrictive is going to always equal commas, and that is to add information. Now, restrictive, we are not going to use commas, and you're going to restrict or limit a larger group to a smaller group, okay? If you need to pause, go ahead and pause, but finish writing that down. All right, now let's see if you guys got it. I'm going to give you 2 examples. Number 1, the passengers who are wearing bell bottoms survived the crash. And then here's your next one. The passengers who were wearing bell bottoms survived the crash. Look at those 2 sentences carefully. One has commas, one doesn't. One is non-restrictive, one is restrictive. Answer these questions. In which sentence do all of the passengers survive? Look at it carefully. Hopefully you got number 1, right? Because in this one, that non-restrictive relative clause is just used like a really big adjective, and those passengers happen to be wearing bell bottoms, right? All right, so in which one do only some survive? Well, obviously, you guys will see that the answer is 2, right? The passengers who are wearing bell bottoms survived the crash, okay? In which are all the passengers wearing bell bottoms? Okay, well, in that one, it's 1, right? Because we're using that relative clause as a big adjective, okay? And then in which are only some wearing bell bottoms? And obviously that one's 2, right? And the ones who happen to be wearing the bell bottoms were the ones who survived the crash. Nobody else. The ones with the slim cut, nope, they died. They died. All right, so for exercise 4's assignment, what we're going to do is we're going to type each of the following sentences that I give to you. When you see an asterisk, you're going to add a relative clause. If you see NR, that means non-restrictive, so you're going to use commas. If you see R, that means that it's restrictive, so you're not going to use commas. All of these sentences come from the book Great Expectations. You don't have to have any knowledge of the book to make up the sentences. You can make them silly if you want, just as long as they still grammatically make sense, okay? So here's my example. It says, Pip, asterisk, was learning to become a blacksmith. So this one says NR. NR means non-restrictive, so we're going to use commas, okay? Pip is the boy's name. Pip is a person, right? So we're going to say, Pip, comma, who was beaten by his father, comma, was learning to become a blacksmith. And unfortunately, that did happen in the book. Okay, so all you're going to do is you're going to add that restrictive clause where that asterisk is. If it's non-restrictive, you're going to use commas. If it's restrictive, you're not going to use commas. Pay attention to the type of noun that you have. Is it a person? Is it a thing? And that's going to help you decide which of those relative pronouns you're going to use. Okay? Good luck.